It's the night of December 25th, 1991, in Moscow, Russia. The communist government is crumbling and Gorbachev has already resigned. Atop the Kremlin, the Soviet flag is lowered as its anthem is played. In its place, the flag of the Russian Federation is raised. The Soviet Union has officially died, and with that, the Cold War has finally ended. After 74 years of communist rule, an independent Russia now enters into a new chapter. Of course, the USSR didn't go down without attempts at reform. The plans of perestroika and glasnost, while good in their intentions, failed to fix the dying state of the nation and ultimately turned out futile. After a failed coup and a resignation from the leader Gorbachev, the Union was no more. Over the 2000s and 2010s, Russia transitioned into an authoritarian democracy and by the modern day became a country riddled with bureaucracy and corruption, carrying the weight of international sanctions. But in this video, I'll talk about a timeline where that doesn't necessarily happen, and where the Soviet leadership managed to save the USSR, leading it not to collapse on Christmas of 1991. To celebrate Christmas coming up, I'll be asking, what if the USSR was reformed? We'll go straight into how the USSR could have been saved. The main point of divergence would be for the August coup attempt on Gorbachev to never happen. In our timeline, a couple months after a referendum for a new union was done, members of the KGB and opponents of Gorbachev attempted a coup in a ditch effort to save the country. Gorbachev was warned multiple times about this coup, even warning many of the coup leaders beforehand, though his warnings were mostly ignored. In this timeline, Gorbachev takes matters into his own hands and arrests the leaders of the anti-government KGB, meaning the coup never happens and allowing a vote for a new, reformed Soviet Union to be passed and solidified. On Christmas Day 1991, Gorbachev declares the founding of the Union of Soviet Sovereign Republics, also known as the Eurasian Union, with some slight differences to the old USSR. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Georgia, and Armenia would no longer be part of the Union and would become independent nations. Ukraine and Azerbaijan would become autonomous regions in the Union, while Russia, Belarus, Georgia, and the Turkic republics would remain fully integrated, except with slightly more self-governance. Immediately after this, the people within the USSR would begin to question the legitimacy of Gorbachev's rule, and would be opposed to this new union. Naturally, rebellious groups would form, mostly in the Caucasus and parts of West Russia. Despite this, Gorbachev would rule through 1992 and into the mid-90s, maintaining a hold on the country and the various elected leaders of the republics. He'd begin calling for more economic reforms, as well as increased efficiency in automation and labor to help fix the nation's damaged state after the 1980s. While many would welcome these changes, the hardline communists would be pissed, and Gorbachev would have to heighten military presence in places where counter-government protests take place. I can see these kinds of protests continuing well into the 2000s. Gorbachev would have to deal with the Chechenian rebels still rising up in this world. In 1996, after a referendum in South Ossetia and a conflict with Georgia, the USSR would strike an agreement with Georgia to allow South Ossetia and Abkhazia back into the Union in exchange for economic support and protection. Azerbaijan would also declare full independence at this time. This very same year, Gorbachev would step down as president due to the strain and would call for the first proper elections. To make a long story short, these elections would be messy, with multiple different parties on both sides of the political spectrum running. In the end, Grigory Yavlinsky of the Russian Yabloko, or United Democratic Party, would win and would become the second president of the Eurasian Union in 1997. Immediately upon entering office, Yavlinsky would open up a new 500-day plan, which would move the country more into a free market economic system. He reverses some of Gorbachev's military protocols and would introduce more socially liberal policies back into the government. In 1998, he would also sign a peace with the Chechen Republic, recognizing their independence and their borders, but still keeping them within the Eurasian sphere of influence. This means that there would be no invasion of Dagestan and no apartment bombings. This also means that the far-right nationalists within the government and the country would find it harder to gain support and favor. Finally, Yavlinsky would pass more economic regulations and reforms that would keep oligarchs from rising the ranks of power and would stop wealth decentralization. All of these drastic changes made to Russian society would be noticed by Western governments and would lead to cordial agreements being signed between the USSR, the US, and the nations of Western Europe by the end of the century. The moderates, who would dominate Russian politics by now, would also support the various new democratic governments in Eastern Europe. With these agreements, the need for the NATO alliance would be called into question by the Western nations. Despite all of this Russian progress, there would still be the issues of the communist hardliners trying to get back into power and the growing poverty rates in Ukraine and especially Transnistria, which would still be disputed between Eurasia and Moldova. We now enter into the 21st century, and the Eurasian Union would begin looking to expand their influence. This would no doubt start a rivalry between Eurasia and China. 9/11 still happens in 2001, and the US would still invade Afghanistan to destroy Al-Qaeda. The only difference would be that, thanks to this new Eurasian-American alliance, the Eurasian Union would likely intervene in Afghanistan too. Besides this, President Yavlinsky would also allow American bases to be built in Central Asia, as well as give America access to airspace. This would be a major development in Russo-American relations. A major development that would, however, be challenged in 2003 when the US begins calling for an invasion of Iraq. Eurasia would counter this and instead call for a joint American and Eurasian investigation to search for weapons of mass destruction in the country. This time, George W. Bush would concede. This means that Saddam Hussein would remain in power in Iraq much longer. This also means that as the 2004 US elections roll around, Bush would probably not even win the Republican Party nomination, with it instead going to New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani. Giuliani would then win the election, becoming the 44th US president, and would go on to get defeated by Obama in 2008. Besides this, the Middle East would have turned into a friendly sphere, with Iraq and Syria basically being untouched. By 2004, many more former Eastern Bloc nations would join the European Union as Eurasia tries to reassert control. In 2005, the Eurasian Union and the EU would start to clash when Transnistrian separatists begin rioting and protesting, causing the Moldovan military to crack down. Eurasia would then send peacekeeping forces into the country in response. The UN would of course condemn this act. This condemnation would be countered by Eurasia as an act of defense. The following year, Moldova would be annexed back into the Union. By 2006 and 2007, Eurasia's growing friendliness to liberal Western values would be seen as a very big problem by most Russians. In the 2008 election, a right-wing party called United Russia would win, and Dmitry Medvedev would become the president of Eurasia. This party is more moderately right-wing though, promoting conservatism over just outright nationalism. The party would also be pretty irredentist, promoting Eurasian claims to former Soviet land. In 2010, the Eurasian Union and China would enter into a proxy conflict over East Turkestan, with the USSR calling for the liberation of Muslims living in the region and an end to Chinese authoritarianism. Additionally, Eurasia would start to question the sovereignty of the Chechenian nation in the Caucasus, reconsidering the referendums and treaties which would guarantee their independence. These provocations would lead to many UN member states calling for the removal of both Eurasia and China from the Security Council. With this sudden rise in irredentism, the USSR would enter into a crossroads going into the 2010s. A crossroads which becomes very difficult to navigate, which is why I'll end the video right here. Thank you all for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know what scenarios I should do for 2024 in the comments. And of course, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.